folks. Welcome once again. Last Sunday service of the year, right? Pretty soon we're going to, as announced, our calendar meeting. And I was just thinking about it when Mike was mentioning that. That just happened like last week. The previous calendar meeting, my mind is boggled by how fast time flies. We do have a treat today. A couple of weeks ago, we finished our series on 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And as we usually do, we flop back and forth from Old Testament to New Testament. So now we are back to the Old Testament, and we are going to start a journey through the book of Daniel. So go ahead and find yourselves, get situated. Can you guys hear me okay? No? Am I on? I'm on. All right. Better? All right. Good morning. Welcome once again. Start from the beginning. So again, we're starting the book of Daniel. And usually when we start a new book, there is a need for us to introduce it a bit. So we'll go through some of this introductory information prior to actually looking into the actual verses and story. So let's go ahead and take a look at, just in general, I'm not going to provide like a PowerPoint or anything of this information, mostly because you guys can find that anywhere nowadays, and even on your Bibles you have little commentaries, so on and so forth. But again, just for us to get situated as to the context of this particular book and story. Historically speaking, here we're talking about the period of time when the kingdom was split. The northern kingdom had already been taken over by Assyria. So that happened in the 700s. More or less, obviously before Christ. So for a while, for a period of about 100 years, the southern kingdom was still intact, called Judah, and was in great danger. A lot of foreign entities, nations, empires were tugging and pulling to see who was going to be the dominant figure at that particular time in history. So here we have a situation where, again, even though the southern kingdom is intact, it is in great peril and danger. And that had already been prophesied for a while because of the Jews being rather disobedient and negligent regarding their responsibilities unto their God, the real God. God had sent messengers, prophets, warning them and foretelling that punishment would come. And here we are essentially in the brink of said punishment and actually experiencing this punishment through the lenses of Daniel. The story basically is a story, especially in the beginning, of teens being kidnapped. Right, sort of like one of those Hallmark movies. Daniel and some of his friends were teenagers when we see the start of this story. And what occurred was the Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, they had this policy. Whenever they attacked and took over, actually take some of the best that they could find. Now we're talking about items, and we're talking about people as well. So because of this policy, Daniel and some of his friends were essentially kidnapped for the purpose of being brainwashed. Now, why was this a smart policy? Basically, if this new empire, who was the most powerful one at that particular time, if they were able to adopt and include some of these conquered people into their court, then it would be less likely for those who are conquered to revolt, because some of their own, quote unquote, were part of the hierarchy of this said power. So that was sort of the scheme that we see happening here, unfolding before our eyes. It was an effort to make sure that these conquered people would not revolt, because they saw some of their own in a position of power and within that new hierarchy. Now, pertaining to timeline, here we're talking about the 6th century prior to Christ. So the 500s, yeah, you got to count backwards, right? So BC. And the book begins basically within this period of the Babylonian captivity that I mentioned. The author, obviously here, the title of the book is the Book of Daniel, and most scholars believe that Daniel was in fact the one that wrote it, even though as you go through the book, you will see Daniel being mentioned in the third person, and then sometimes in the first person. It goes back and forth, but that's merely stylistic. Very likely he was in fact the one that wrote this particular piece of history, and a lot of it has to do with prophecy as well. So the book of Daniel is interesting because we have 12 chapters. The initial basically contain a series of stories, each almost separated by the chapters that we have here. So there are basically 6 self-contained stories within the first half of the book, and then in the latter half of the book, we have these visions and these prophecies. So the first half of the book is fairly easy for us to digest. The second half of the book is going to get crazy, because you have all these signs and these prophecies and these things that are very hard to understand, to teach, and again, to digest. But the first half is not too bad. And here, what we have in store for us today is basically the first of these series of stories, again, that are being told in the beginning of the book of Daniel. As far as kind of trying to understand the theme and the style, think about Daniel being the equivalent of the book of Revelations, but in the Old Testament, especially because the latter part of this particular book, there are so many prophecies, things that were yet to come. It served a similar purpose. So the book of Revelation, as you know, it's kind of crazy. A lot of things that are very hard to understand, and mostly it's a foretelling of things that are yet to come. So during the time that Daniel wrote this book, piece of history, but also prophecy, he was essentially trying to encourage these people that were captives of the Babylonian Empire, to encourage them to continue to trust in God. And how was he doing that? He was basically documenting things that were part of God's will and part of God's plans, so that they could be assured that God didn't leave them forever, that God was not defeated by these foreign entities, that God was still in control. So even though they were going to suffer for a period of more or less 7 years, Daniel, through these visions and these prophecies, wanted to let them know basically that yes, they were being punished. Others had come before, such as Jeremiah, for example, and specified the punishment that was to come. But even though they were experiencing said punishment, that God had not totally forgot them and still had plans for his people. And pertaining to an overall theme. So as we go through the process of gleaning truths and looking at the stories that are before us, there is an overall theme, and the overall theme is basically this idea that even though these world powers were scheming, and even though nations were falling. And even though kings were being attacked and taken out of their role and being replaced by other kings that were more puppet kings and rulers than anything else, even though all of those things were happening, the overall theme of this book is the fact that God was still sovereign. And he had control over all of these affairs, over the leaders, over the kings, over the nations, over every single aspect of history. So there is this highlight of God's sovereignty throughout the book of Daniel. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll try to get through the entire first chapter, 21 verses. It's a narrative, so it's very easy for us to digest this information. And we'll do so a little bit different. Usually I read all the way through and we go back. But because it is a narrative, it's kind of nice for us to take it one step at a time. So we'll take a look at the first couple of verses initially, and then we'll move on from there. So I'll read, and you guys can follow along. I think we do have a projection, do we? The first couple of verses again of chapter 1 of Daniel. And it says here, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem to besiege it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hands with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So within these first couple of verses, we already are situated historically. A king is mentioned here, King Jehoiakim. He was actually one of the last sitting kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. Although how he rose to power, it was actually somewhat different than usual. Jehoiakim's father was Josiah. Now, Josiah was a good king. If you know your history of all the kings of Judah specifically, that kept this lineage of David intact, right? The northern kingdom, they were all over the place. The kings of Judah, the lineage of David remained. And some of them were good, some of them not so good. Josiah was a good king, but he was followed by his sons who were unfortunately rotten kings. And again, Jehoiakim was one of these last sitting kings prior to the total destruction and taking over of the southern kingdom. Actually, when Josiah died, his other son took charge, but he only lasted a few months because partly because he was unfaithful to God, so that was, punishment, but also because the Pharaoh of Egypt was one of these superpowers that was, basically trying to conquer the world, like Pinky and the Brain, right? And this was a strategic location, a nation that these powers that were trying to, again, be the main power, it was somewhat of a trophy nation that they wanted to conquer. So Pharaoh attacked, he took away that first king of Josiah and replaced him with Josiah's other son, who is Jehoiakim. He actually had a different name, so he was renamed by the Pharaoh or the king of Egypt. If we're just kind of looking at history as found in the Bible, Jehoiakim is also part of the story of Jeremiah. So the book of Jeremiah and the prophet Jeremiah, very well known, famous, and he was the king, one of the primary kings that Jeremiah was interacting with when he was bringing the prophecy of punishment that was to come for the nation and for the people of God. And there's that weird incident where Jeremiah, along with his scribe, they were writing, basically the content of his book and these prophecies. And the king, which was this king, he read that content and was furious and was upset to the point where he destroyed it, and Jeremiah had to do it all over again. So for those of you, especially students, who have ever spent hours and hours and hours and days on an essay and forgot to save, know how Jeremiah felt when all of that body of work was destroyed. Technically, it was a scroll, and I don't say that word. Did I say it right? I usually say a squirrel, which is really hard to write on. So it's the body of work of Jeremiah. But anyway, so Jehoiakim was that king that destroyed that. Okay, so other stories that he was a part of. And here, another bit of information that is important. We also see the fact that not only Nebuchadnezzar came to take over this region, there was a purpose. Now I mentioned, Jehoiakim came to power because the Pharaoh of Egypt placed him there and renamed him. Now, Babylon was sort of fighting for this right to be the biggest power, the strongest nation in the world at that particular time. So they were kind of competing with Egypt. Egypt actually had attacked Babylon, and now Babylon and the Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, they were countering this attack by trying to take over Judah, which basically was somewhat of a possession of Egypt. So this is how this maneuvering is happening, and the reason why Nebuchadnezzar chose to do this at this particular time. He was actually countering what the Pharaoh of Egypt was doing during this period of time in world history. So Nebuchadnezzar goes, attacks Judah, takes it over, starts to bring in some of these elite, the youth and the nobility of Judah, but also takes some of the articles of the temple. Now think about this for a second. How humiliating this is. Not only taking the best people, but also the best things. So Nebuchadnezzar wanted to send a message. What was the message? The message was, I am more powerful than Egypt, and I am more powerful than you. And my gods are more powerful than your God, to the point where I can just go into his house and plunder and take his possessions. So this is the context, not only historical context, but think about psychologically what these people were going through. Again, their God was seemingly defeated. Their nation was at the brink of being totally taken over. Their whole society and their ways of living, their culture, it was all about to extinct. And this is the context in which Daniel is writing this body of work and this piece of literature. So now the story goes on. Again, we have this historical context established within the first couple of verses. And now, on verse 3 to verse 7, we have more information. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So let's stop right there. I can never read those names without thinking of VeggieTales. For whatever reason. What's that? Exactly. There's no way for me not to picture little vegetables talking with, which is actually very ironic because this story is all about vegetables, right? So it just fits right in. Also, for those of us who are getting over our food coma, it's kind of a nice story for us to be motivated to a healthier lifestyle. But anyway, all of that is besides the point. So now we get to the portion of the story where, again, some of these captives were being named, including Daniel, for them. And we get a little bit of the selection process. They had to be the brightest. We don't know if they had to take a quiz, real quick, like pre-SATs, so they knew who were the smartest. We knew that they were high-ranking. They were part of the nobility. So Daniel and his friends, they were, in the upper echelon of the Judean society, right? They were teens, so somewhere from 13 to 19, we don't know for sure, but very young men. Again, very good-looking, healthy, and intelligent. The cream of the crop. And they came and were brought to essentially the court of Nebuchadnezzar to be trained, to be prepped for 3 years. And during this time, they were going to be taught the culture, the language, how, the empire worked. They were going to eat great food and drink great, wine, I guess. They were going to be pampered. They were going to be treated like nobility because, again, they were prepping them to be part of their hierarchy with the purpose of putting them on display so that these Judean captives would not want to revolt, would not want to fight back because they saw some of their own up there working with their foe and working with their primary enemy, which was this empire and this emperor. And there is, the information of the changing of names, and that was all part of this ploy to totally alter their way of life and their reality, their worldviews, and even their belief system. So the original names of Daniel and their friends had all some relationship to God. I think I made a reference here. Daniel means God is my judge, for example. Hananiah means beloved by the Lord. Mishael means who is God, or who is a God. And Azariah means the Lord is my help, which was very common to have names that were somehow connected to God. And all of those names were replaced by these other names that had connections with foreign deities. So again, they were trying to totally indoctrinate and brainwash these individuals so that they would adopt this new way of being. Now let's see what happens as the story continues to unfold. Let's take a look at verse 8 to verse 16. And it says here, but Daniel, and by the way, we don't know why Daniel kept his name. From here on, mostly the three friends are mentioned by their new names, but Daniel remains to be called Daniel, most likely because he is the primary character of the story, but we really don't have a reason as to why he maintained his original name. So again, it says here, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appear better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus, the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So let's stop right there. I probably read one extra verse than I should have. So now, Daniel, along with his buddies, they have to make a choice. Basically, what they were doing were, or I should say, what this person who was in charge, what he was trying to do was, again, to totally alter and change their ways of life. So they have new names. Now they were being taught new things, and they were experiencing the pleasures of the Babylonian Empire, including the food and the delicacies. It is interesting that as we look at the narrative, at the story, we don't hear or see or read Daniel nor his friends complaining about having their names changed. We don't see that revolting. Even though Daniel maintained his name, the other ones were called by, from here on, they would be called by their new names. And we don't see them revolting against the system because they got new names. We don't see them rejecting the education that was provided to them. We don't see that. We don't see them, shutting their ears, running away from this instruction, saying that they would not learn a thing, pouting. Again, we don't see that. However, we do see them take a stand when it came to the food and the wine that was going to be provided for them. Why? That's the question. Why? Likely it wasn't kosher, but that's not it. Because there were other things that they could have eaten that were provided for them. And God didn't have really a regulation against wine. Maybe the foods were, in fact, provided as a worship to gods and idols, but we even see that premise in the New Testament being challenged because ultimately there is only one true God. So even though those are legitimate reasons, they really do not reach the heart of the matter here. And the heart of the matter, as we see here, knowing what is to come and how the story is unfolding, it's the fact that Daniel and his friends, even though they were in a very limited and limiting situation, they were in a foreign country. They were captives of a foreign kingdom. They had lost most everything and were totally in a position of inferiority, right? They could not fight back with any might, with any power, with any authority. They were literally in a position of total submission. So they couldn't, again, revolt against the system totally and completely. But even though they could not do everything, they took a stand and did something. And it wasn't, again, just about the wine or just about the food. It was about drawing a line in the sand. It was about telling their captives in a very polite manner. Do you see how Daniel is very political in that sense? He's not, shouting things. He's not pointing fingers. He is not, again, trying to cause a big fuss. He's very polite. He had gained the favor of his captives. We saw that God was the one that is orchestrating all of this. He enabled Daniel to be such a person. Nevertheless, Daniel and his friends, they are taking a stand. Why? Because they understand something very important. What do they understand? If you have your bulletins or if you took a look at it beforehand, you see that the title of our message is Faithful in a Foreign Land. Faithful in a foreign land. And usually, this story is very familiar, right? So here I'm not really reading things and saying things that you are not familiar with, which is why I'm not going into great detail about these things, because again, a story and stories that are to come that we have read and heard and talked about almost ad nauseum. But again, faithful in a foreign land. Usually when we look at a story like this, specifically this particular story, the highlight is how Daniel and his friends remained faithful. And part of that had to do with them denying the delicacies, the goodies of the Babylonian Empire. And even though that perspective may be legitimate, it is a truth that can be gleaned from a passage and a story like this. If we really truly evaluate this idea of faithfulness, the primary person that was being faithful here is God. God was being faithful, even though his people, they were in a foreign land. Now, Daniel and his friends' actions, attitudes, reactions, bravery, this is honorable, right? I don't want to lessen and I don't want to decrease the fact that they were truly paying the price for taking a stand. But the primary person who is being faithful here is actually God. And this is what is being highlighted here. Again, even though many of these stories, including this one, we sort of see these characters, these human characters, being highlighted as heroes of faith, if you will, courageous people that again, regardless of the circumstances, were not willing to budge in their principles, even though those are parts of the story. The main character throughout is God. And what is being highlighted here is that he is faithful, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how bad things got. The people who were originally reading this book needed this type of information. They needed to understand that God did not leave them, that God still had a plan, that God did not forget about them, that God was not defeated, that God was still with them, as faithful as he had ever been. So again, Daniel and his friends drew a line in the sand, and they said, "We will not eat nor drink. Just give us some veggies. Give us some vegetables." Very likely, their diet did not only consist of broccoli and carrots and water. When it is stated here that they were replacing the delicacies of the Babylonian court with vegetables, very likely that's a reference to a vegetarian diet. So they probably had grains as well and anything else that a vegetarian would eat along with water. But again, those were the limitations that they had established. And along with that, they established this period of time when they would be evaluated. So when that period of time was exhausted and expired after 10 days, the person in charge compared them to the other people who were in their situation that ate and drank of the delicacies of the Babylonians. Now, when it's stated here that they looked better, it didn't mean that the other people looked horrible. The other people just looked normal. They looked fine. They looked as good as one can expect. So again, when the evaluation came, and when we read it, it almost seems like those other people were just, about to faint and die and looked like a mess. No, they looked fine. They looked as they would be expected to look. These good food, great wine, very likely, very good environment to live in. So they looked fine. The difference was how much better than fine, than normal, than expected Daniel and his friends looked. It had nothing to do with vegetables. It had nothing to do with water. It had to do with divine intervention. They looked amazing. Just incredible. I have no idea exactly how. The description here is that they were a little, plumper. But they looked amazing. And that was a miracle from above because it should not have occurred. At the very least, they should have just looked the same. But they looked even better. And again, why? Because of their decision to eat vegetables? No. It was because God was acting in a miraculous way because he remained faithful. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the end of the story. I'll start from 17, a verse that I have already read. And as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them. Among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So here we have the conclusion of this first mini story. There are many more to come, 5 more to be exact. But the highlight here is the faithfulness of God. God's people needed to understand and to be reminded that even though it seemed like a very bleak situation, the kingdom fell. The people were conquered. It didn't mean that God was defeated. God did not lose to the gods of Assyria who took over the kingdom of the north. God did not lose to the Egyptians who were the original people who were trying to conquer the southern kingdom. And much less, God did not lose to the Babylonians. Because here we see how regardless of the circumstances, he was still in charge. And he was actually doing all of this for a particular purpose. A purpose that would only be fully clear and understood many hundred years after. It was establishing puzzles and pieces of this puzzle so that eventually, even though all of these kings and these empires are doing their thing, eventually he would put on display the one and only true king, Christ Jesus, who would eventually come and establish his reign, partially, but also as a precursor to the full reign that he will experience eventually and inevitably. So again, just as a closing remark, the highlight is God's faithfulness. In your bulletins as well, we usually have these little verses, reflection verses, right? And I put Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23 for this week. And Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful." Once again, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithfulness. Ultimately, our faithfulness is merely hanging on, holding on. That is the perfect description of our faithfulness. We are holding on. We are holding tight. We are not letting go. Why? Because of our knowledge of God's faithfulness. If we know that God is faithful, if we understand that he keeps his word, if we accept the fact that his will be done, and that will is perfect, it's good, it's beneficial, there's no other thing, there's no other action, there's no other way of living other than just holding on, keeping, maintaining the faith that we profess, establishing boundaries and lines in the sand, not succumbing to the world's ideals. You don't have to revolt against the system. You don't have to counter every single thing that you deal with in normal life. But there are certain things that we just don't do. Why? Because he is faithful and we hold on.